Joining us now, CNBC Global supply chain reporter Lori-Ann LaRocco and Bloomberg News anchor and correspondent David Gura. Lori-Ann, what's it like at the ports right now with these tariffs?
It is ugly, Katie. We actually have a quintuple tariff hit today. The first is the 10% tariff on timber and the 25% tariff on kitchen cabinets and furniture. This is going to be inflationary, Katie, for the consumer as well as the home builders. And just if you think those tariffs aren't high enough, they're going to increase in the new year. Furniture is going to go up 30%, and the kitchen cabinets are going to double to 50%. Now, eventually, those costs will be passed over to the consumer. Now, consumers need to be aware that a lot of this product was front-loaded before these tariffs, so technically the prices should not go up immediately. Now, the other set of tariffs that is hitting the pockets of the businesses is the fees on port entry fees for Chinese-made vessels and Chinese-built cranes at the U.S. ports. Now, China is the leader in both shipbuilding and crane manufacturing. And the tariffs are really, really steep. You're looking at a 270% tariff, Katie, on cranes. That's the fee. And then when it comes to the port, the port fees for the ocean carriers that are Chinese entities as well as Chinese made, they are going to be paying in upwards of over $16 million a year in fees. And for the other ocean carriers that may have vessels that are made in China, they're going to be paying a $10 million fee. Now, there have been some instances where the vessels have been swapped out for the non-Chinese owned carriers. But in the end, you know, they're not passing it on now, but who knows in the future if that's going to be the case.
So the justification for this was and continues to be, at least one of the justifications, is to bring manufacturing home to America. Have we seen evidence that it is spurring a rise in manufacturing? Are new factories being built, new jobs being filled?
You know, we have seen some instances, but not across the board. In fact, I was on a call with DHL about 2 hours ago, and they said that they have not seen a significant increase in products coming back to America. In fact, you're just seeing with the flow of trade that it's just being shifted around everywhere else except America.
So, David, that doesn't sound great.
No, it doesn't. And, I think getting back to your first question just about when these are going to come into effect, that's why this Goldman Sachs note is so significant. Is it's saying that by the end of this year, 55% of those tariffs are going to be borne by consumers. And as Lori-Ann was saying just a moment ago, we've seen companies on the one hand, getting goods early on so they could front load this. On the other hand, just kind of waiting to see how this is going to play out. And that, of course, has been the overarching theme of this whole process since Liberation Day is what's going to stick, what's not going to stick. Is the president, as he did Friday, going to come out and say, oh, I'm going to levy 100% more on Chinese-made goods and then walk that back over the course of the weekend? That's what manufacturers and importers are having to deal with here. And I think one other factor that bears watching is sort of how this plays out in the courts. And we're getting very close to the point at which the Supreme Court is going to consider whether or not these tariffs are legal. I think it's likely you could look at what's happening with those ships and planes and say, OK, maybe there are some national security grounds for these tariffs being in place. I think it becomes a lot harder when we're talking about you buying a couch or putting a Lazy Susan in your kitchen to make the argument that there's a national security ground for placing those tariffs on hardwoods and softwoods and furniture becomes much more difficult. And I think you have a lot of companies just sort of waiting to see, can they get something more unequivocal from the courts here on whether or not these tariffs are going to stay in place, Katie?
So we have the courts that we're waiting for, but we're also coming up on holiday season. What is what should the expectation be for people who are looking to buy gifts or to travel during this holiday season, David?
I go back to April when these were first announced, and you heard from some big retailers. Then you heard from the likes of Walmart and Target that this was bound to be inflationary. These tariffs were going to lead to higher prices. And those big retailers in particular indicated that they were going to do what they could to keep that from happening. But the longer that we move ourselves from April and those tariffs go into effect, the harder that's going to be. So I think that consumers are likely to face rising prices. We've seen them. As you pointed out, that Harvard survey indicates that we're seeing prices going up. I suspect we're going to see retailers doing what they can to keep those prices lower, but there's kind of a push and pull here, and there's only so much they can do, Katie.
So During Donald Trump's first term, he kept touting that he was the best president for black employment, for African-American employment. This term, not so much. The New York Times is reporting that the joblessness for black workers is rising again 2 years after reaching a record low. And they argue it's a troubling indicator. Joblessness often spikes higher for historically marginalized groups during economic downturns and takes longer to fall. David.
That history is important. The lesson that we can learn from that is so important here. And you can go back to 2023, kind of before the pandemic, when the unemployment rate for black Americans was, I think, 4.8%, so significantly lower. This is a sizable gain and one that's very worrisome. And I guess we have to put it in this broader context, which is this is a moment when we want to know as much as we can about the health and state of the labor market in this country. And the government shutdown that we're in 2 weeks into is doing us no favors in terms of knowing who's being affected, what issues are at play. That's certainly an issue for the Federal Reserve as it tries to chart policy going forward here. But for all kinds of economists and businesses, both small and big, as they sort of weigh what they're going to do here in the future. So it is worrisome what we're seeing in terms of black unemployment among women as well. And I think what's really important to underscore, what you just said a moment ago, is once you see those kinds of gains among minority populations, history tells us that it takes a lot longer to reverse them than it would for the broader population.
All right, David Gura, Lorianne LaRocco, thank you. And